Colonel David Ashkenazi stepped out of the black diplomatic car onto the cobblestones of Whitehall, adjusting his perfectly pressed Israeli Defense Forces uniform. The morning sun cast long shadows across the famous street as he surveyed the scene before him. At 42 years old, David had commanded respect throughout his military career, from the dusty training grounds of the Negev to the tense borders of Gaza. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, known for his sharp tactical mind and unwavering authority. Today's mission seemed straightforward enough. The Israeli embassy had arranged a ceremonial visit to several British military installations as part of a joint defense cooperation initiative. David had been personally selected by the Chief of Staff to represent Israel, an honor that filled him with pride. He had spent weeks preparing, studying British military protocols and reviewing diplomatic procedures. However, there was one aspect of British tradition that David found rather theatrical and, frankly, unnecessary. As he walked toward the iconic gates of Buckingham Palace, David couldn't help but smirk at the sight of the royal guard standing at attention. Their tall black bearskin hats, bright red tunics, and stoic expressions struck him as more suited for a tourist attraction than serious military duty. In his mind, these soldiers were little more than ceremonial decorations, a far cry from the battle-hardened warriors he commanded back home. The morning air was crisp, and tourists had already begun gathering along the palace railings, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. David observed the crowd with mild amusement, noting how visitors from around the world seemed captivated by what he considered an outdated display of pomp and circumstance. His own military experience had been forged in real conflict, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, not in practicing elaborate marching routines for entertainment. David's aide, Lieutenant Sarah Cohen, walked beside him, tablet in hand as she reviewed the day's schedule. She had worked with the colonel for 3 years and knew his personality well. While she respected his military achievements, she sometimes worried about his tendency to be overly direct, especially in diplomatic situations that required more finesse than battlefield command. "Sir, the embassy briefing mentioned the importance of respecting local customs during our visit," Sarah said quietly, hoping to remind him of the cultural sensitivity requirements they had discussed during preparation. David waved dismissively. "These aren't real soldiers, Lieutenant. They're performers in uniforms. Our meeting with the British Defense Ministry is what matters today, not this tourist show." His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own judgment, particularly when it came to military matters. As they approached the palace gates, David noticed the meticulous precision with which the guards maintained their positions. Their rifles were held at exact angles, their posture was flawless, and their eyes remained fixed straight ahead despite the constant chatter and camera flashes from the growing crowd of onlookers. Still, he remained unimpressed, viewing their discipline as mere theater rather than genuine military bearing. The colonel had risen through the ranks during some of Israel's most challenging periods. He had led successful operations in Lebanon, commanded troops during the Second Intifada, and earned multiple commendations for his service. His soldiers respected him for his tactical brilliance and his willingness to share the dangers they faced. But this success had also cultivated in him a certain arrogance, particularly toward military traditions he deemed inferior to Israeli pragmatism. Sarah noticed her commanding officer's dismissive attitude and felt a growing sense of unease. The British had been generous hosts, and their military cooperation with Israel was valuable to both nations. She hoped the colonel would remember the broader diplomatic implications of their visit, especially given the carefully planned nature of the cultural exchange program. David checked his watch and noted they were ahead of schedule. The official ceremony wouldn't begin for another 30 minutes, but he was already eager to move on to what he considered the substantive part of their visit. He had prepared extensively for his meetings with British defense officials, armed with detailed presentations about Israeli military innovations and strategic capabilities that he believed would impress his counterparts. The gathering crowd around them grew larger and more diverse, with families, school groups, and individual tourists all positioning themselves for the best view of the upcoming ceremony. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, while parents attempted to manage their excitement. Tour guides spoke in multiple languages, explaining the historical significance of the ritual they were about to witness. David found himself studying the guards more closely, noting their youth and wondering about their actual combat experience. In his military, soldiers their age would already have seen action, would have proven themselves under fire. These young men, standing motionless in their elaborate uniforms, seemed to him like actors playing dress-up rather than warriors prepared for battle. The morning continued to unfold around them as London awakened to another day. Black taxis navigated the busy streets, double-decker buses carried commuters to work, and the steady stream of pedestrians created the familiar rhythm of the city. For David, this was just another foreign capital, another diplomatic obligation in a career filled with international engagements. He had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would challenge everything he thought he knew about military tradition, respect, and the true meaning of disciplined service. The stage was set for an encounter that would become legendary among both Israeli and British military personnel, a story that would be retold in officers' clubs and training academies for years to come. David Ashkenazi, confident in his authority and dismissive of British ceremony, was about to learn a lesson in humility that no amount of military experience could have prepared him for. The ceremonial clock above the palace gates chimed the quarter hour, and David noticed the subtle shift in the guards' formation. What had appeared to be static positioning now revealed itself as carefully coordinated movement, with each soldier maintaining perfect alignment, despite the gradual repositioning taking place. Still, he remained unconvinced that this elaborate display represented genuine military competence. A group of American tourists nearby were discussing the guards' famous stoicism, sharing stories they had heard about the soldiers' legendary ability to remain motionless regardless of distractions. One elderly woman mentioned reading about guards who had stood firm even when tourists tried to provoke reactions, while a young father pointed out to his children how the soldiers never seemed to blink or acknowledge the crowd. David overheard these conversations with growing irritation. The idea that standing still qualified as impressive military behavior seemed ridiculous to someone who had spent his career in active combat zones. In his mind, real soldiers responded to threats, adapted to changing situations, and demonstrated their worth through action, not through elaborate exercises in remaining motionless while wearing ceremonial costumes. Lieutenant Cohen continued to monitor their schedule while observing her superior's increasingly critical demeanor. She had studied British military history during her preparation for this trip and understood that the Royal Guards were actually active duty, soldiers from elite regiments who served both ceremonial and operational roles. However, she knew better than to contradict the colonel when he was in this mood, especially in public. The crowd around them continued to thicken as the official ceremony time approached. School children on educational trips chattered excitedly, while their teachers attempted to maintain order and provide historical context. Professional photographers adjusted their equipment, hoping to capture the perfect shot of the famous ritual. Street vendors nearby prepared for the increased foot traffic that always accompanied the popular tourist attraction. David's attention was caught by a conversation between two British tourists who were explaining the ceremony to their visiting relatives. They spoke with obvious pride about the tradition, describing how the guards represented some of Britain's finest military units and how their ceremonial duties were considered a great honor. The colonel found their reverence both amusing and somewhat pathetic, further reinforcing his belief that the British had lost sight of what real military service meant. As the official start time drew nearer, David noticed increased activity among the guards. Officers appeared to be conducting final inspections, checking equipment and ensuring every detail met the exacting standards required for the ceremony. The precision of their movements was undeniable, but David attributed this to endless rehearsal rather than genuine military skill. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting the palace facade in warm golden light that made the scene even more picturesque for the assembled tourists. Professional tour guides began gathering their groups, providing final briefings about what they were about to witness. The anticipation in the air was palpable, with cameras being raised and conversations growing quieter as people positioned themselves for the best possible view. David checked his phone and noted several messages from colleagues back in Jerusalem, asking about his impressions of London and the British military. He mentally composed responses that would emphasize the theatrical nature of what he was witnessing, perhaps including some humorous observations about the contrast between British ceremony and Israeli practicality. Lieutenant. Cohen noticed her commanding officer's expression and recognized the signs of his growing impatience. She had seen this look before, usually right before he made decisions that prioritized efficiency over diplomacy. While she respected his military judgment, she worried about the potential consequences of any cultural missteps during such a high-profile visit. The assembled guards now stood in perfect formation, their rifles held at identical angles, their posture so precise it seemed almost supernatural. Every button gleamed, every crease was razor-sharp, and every movement was executed with mechanical precision. To the tourists, this display represented the epitome of military bearing and discipline. To David, it represented everything that was wrong with armies that prioritized appearance over substance. A nearby security officer, clearly British, was speaking into his radio while surveying the crowd. David noticed the professional way he carried himself and the sharp awareness in his eyes as he scanned for potential problems. This man at least seemed like a real soldier rather than a ceremonial decoration. It occurred to David that perhaps not all British military personnel were caught up in this theatrical tradition. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness for the impatient Israeli colonel. He had already seen enough of what he considered to be an elaborate charade, and was eager to move on to the serious business of the day. His meetings with British defense officials promised to be far more productive than standing around watching young men play dress-up in elaborate uniforms. Sarah noticed that her superior was becoming increasingly restless and hoped he would remember the diplomatic importance of showing proper respect for their host's traditions, regardless of his personal opinions. The success of their mission depended on maintaining positive relationships with their British counterparts, and any cultural insensitivity could have lasting consequences for future cooperation. The stage was now set for the collision between David's dismissive attitude and the deeply ingrained traditions of one of the world's most prestigious military institutions. His confidence in his own superior understanding of military matters was about to be challenged in a way that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present, including himself. The decisive moment arrived when David spotted what appeared to be a minor disruption in the guards' formation. One of the younger soldiers seemed to shift slightly, barely perceptible to most observers but enough to catch the colonel's trained eye. To David, this represented the perfect opportunity to demonstrate what he saw as the fundamental weakness of ceremonial soldiering compared to real military discipline. Without consulting his aide or considering the diplomatic implications, David strode purposefully toward the formation. His military bearing was unmistakable as he approached the guards with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding immediate respect. The crowd of tourists began to take notice, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Lieutenant Cohen felt her heart skip a beat as she watched her superior break away from their designated viewing area. She had worked with David long enough to recognize when he was about to make an impulsive decision, and the determined look on his face suggested that no amount of protocol was going to stop him. She quickened her pace to follow, hoping to minimize whatever diplomatic damage was about to occur. The guards remained motionless as the Israeli officer approached, their eyes fixed straight ahead according to their strict orders. However, David interpreted their lack of acknowledgement as either disrespect or evidence of their theatrical nature. In his mind, real soldiers would have recognized his approach and shown appropriate military courtesy to a visiting officer of his rank. David stopped directly in front of the formation and cleared his throat loudly, expecting some form of recognition. When none came, he felt his irritation spike. The tourists around them began to murmur with curiosity, phones and cameras turning to capture whatever was about to unfold. Tour guides looked concerned, recognizing that this deviation from the normal ceremony could potentially cause problems. "Attention," David barked in heavily accented English, using the commanding voice that had intimidated subordinates throughout his career. The word echoed off the palace walls with unmistakable authority, causing nearby tourists to jump slightly at the unexpected volume. However, the guards remained perfectly still, their discipline unbroken by the foreign officer's command. The lack of response only fueled David's conviction that these soldiers were poorly trained actors, rather than real military personnel. In his experience, any properly disciplined soldier would have immediately responded to a command from a senior officer, regardless of nationality. Their continued stillness struck him as either incompetence or deliberate insubordination. Sarah reached her superior's side just as he was preparing to escalate the situation further. She could see the warning signs in his posture and expression, the same look he wore before dressing down subordinates who had disappointed him. Her diplomatic training screamed warnings about the cultural minefield they were entering, but she knew better than to contradict him publicly. "These men need proper instruction in military courtesy," David announced loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and his Israeli accent added an exotic element that captured the attention of tourists who were now openly staring at the unfolding drama. The security officer David had noticed earlier was now speaking urgently into his radio, clearly concerned about the situation developing at the palace gates. Other officials in the area began to take notice, recognizing that something was going seriously wrong with what should have been a routine ceremonial display. David stepped closer to the nearest guard, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25 years old. The soldier's face remained expressionless beneath the imposing bearskin hat, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the crowd. To David, this blank expression represented everything he found frustrating about ceremonial military units that prioritized appearance over genuine military competence. "Young man, when a senior officer addresses you, the proper response is acknowledgement and respect," David declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. The crowd had now grown noticeably quieter, sensing the tension building in the scene before them. Cameras continued to record, capturing what many assumed was some sort of planned demonstration or educational display. The Israeli colonel's military decorations glinted in the morning sun as he stood before the motionless guard, expecting his rank and experience to command immediate recognition. His confidence remained unshaken, built on decades of successful command where his authority had never been seriously questioned. He had no way of knowing that he was about to encounter a form of military discipline that operated by entirely different rules than those he understood. Lieutenant Cohen watched with growing alarm as her superior's voice grew louder and more demanding. She could see curious faces in the crowd, some looking amused while others appeared concerned about the growing confrontation. Tour guides were beginning to shepherd their groups toward better viewing positions, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become a memorable story for their clients. The young guard's training had prepared him for many types of distractions and provocations, but dealing with a foreign military officer who clearly misunderstood British ceremonial protocol presented a unique challenge. His orders were explicit about maintaining position regardless of civilian interference, but this situation fell into a gray area that would require careful handling by his superiors. The situation reached its tipping point when David, frustrated by the continued lack of response, decided to demonstrate what he considered proper military discipline. Drawing on his experience as a training officer, he positioned himself directly in front of the young guard and began issuing commands in a voice that had shaped countless soldiers throughout his career. "Soldier, I am ordering you to adjust your stance and acknowledge a superior officer," David commanded, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. The crowd of tourists had now grown substantially, with people abandoning their planned routes to witness what appeared to be an unprecedented confrontation between a foreign officer and the famous royal guards. The young guardsman, whose name was Private James Morrison, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duties. His combat experience included situations far more dangerous than dealing with an overly assertive foreign visitor, but his current orders were crystal clear about maintaining position regardless of distractions. The irony was not lost on him that his actual military experience far exceeded what this visiting officer seemed to assume. Lieutenant Cohen stepped closer to her superior, desperately hoping to find a way to de-escalate the situation before it caused a serious diplomatic incident. She could see British officials in the distance beginning to converge on their location, their expressions suggesting that the situation was being taken very seriously indeed. Her diplomatic training told her that they were approaching a point of no return. "Colonel, perhaps we should respect their ceremonial protocols," Sarah whispered urgently, trying to provide him with a face-saving exit strategy. However, her suggestion only seemed to strengthen David's resolve to prove his point about the superiority of practical military training over ceremonial pageantry. David's voice grew even more commanding as he continued his impromptu lesson in what he believed constituted proper military behavior. In a real army, soldiers respond to legitimate authority. This theatrical nonsense is exactly why ceremonial units fail in actual combat situations. His words carried clearly across the courtyard, creating a buzz of conversation among the assembled tourists who were now witnessing something far more dramatic than they had expected. What David didn't realize was that his words were being heard not only by the tourists and his own aide, but also by several off-duty British military personnel who happened to be in the area. Their expressions ranged from amusement to growing irritation as they listened to the foreign officers' critique of their military traditions and the competence of their colleagues. The young guard remained motionless, his training and discipline preventing any visible reaction to the increasingly aggressive verbal assault. However, his commanding officer, Captain William Harrison, had been monitoring the situation from a nearby observation post and was now making his way through the crowd with purposeful strides that suggested the confrontation was about to take a very different turn. Captain Harrison was a veteran of multiple deployments, including Iraq and Afghanistan, where he had earned commendations for leadership under fire. His ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace were considered an honor, assigned only to officers who had distinguished themselves in operational roles. Unlike David, who saw ceremony as separate from real military service, Harrison understood that the discipline required for ceremonial duties was simply another expression of the same military excellence that served soldiers in combat. The crowd sensed the approaching change in dynamics as the British captain moved through their ranks with obvious authority and purpose. His dress uniform was immaculate, his bearing unmistakably military, and his expression suggested that he was not pleased with what he was witnessing. Cameras began focusing on him as tourists realized they were about to see the situation escalate to a new level. David, still focused on his impromptu lecture to the motionless guard, didn't immediately notice the approaching British officer. His confidence remained unshaken as he continued to demonstrate what he believed was proper military leadership. "Young man, in my army we teach soldiers to think, to respond, to adapt to situations. This robot-like behavior serves no military purpose whatsoever." Lieutenant Cohen was the first to spot Captain Harrison's approach, and her diplomatic instincts immediately went into overdrive. She could see from the British officer's expression that they were about to face consequences that would go far beyond mere embarrassment. Her mind raced through potential damage control strategies, knowing that her superior's reputation and their mission's success hung in the balance. The assembled tourists had now formed a rough semicircle around the unfolding drama, many recording on their phones what they assumed would be an interesting story to share with friends back home. Tour guides found themselves in the awkward position of trying to manage their groups while witnessing something that clearly wasn't part of the standard palace experience. Captain Harrison finally reached the scene, and the authority in his bearing was immediately apparent to everyone present except David, who remained focused on his critique of British military standards. The British officer's arrival marked the moment when David's confidence would collide head-on with the reality of military traditions he had never truly understood, setting the stage for a lesson in humility that would redefine his understanding of discipline, respect, and the true nature of professional soldiering. "I believe you're addressing one of my soldiers, Colonel," came a crisp, unmistakably authoritative voice from behind David. The Israeli officer turned to find himself face-to-face with Captain Harrison, whose bearing immediately commanded respect, even from someone as confident as David. The British officer's uniform was perfectly pressed, his posture impeccable, and his expression suggested barely controlled professional displeasure. David's initial reaction was one of relief. Assuming he had finally encountered a real soldier who would understand his frustration with the ceremonial nonsense he had been witnessing. "Captain, thank goodness. Perhaps you can explain to your man here the importance of proper military courtesy when addressed by a senior officer. This theatrical behavior is precisely why ceremonial units lack combat effectiveness." Captain Harrison's expression didn't change, but those familiar with British military culture would have recognized the subtle signs of a professional soldier reaching the limits of his patience. "Colonel, with respect, you appear to be operating under several serious misunderstandings about both my soldier and our military traditions. The crowd of tourists had grown even larger, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Phones continued recording as people positioned themselves for better views of what was clearly becoming a significant confrontation between military officers from different nations. Tour guides found themselves in the unprecedented situation of managing groups who were more interested in this unscripted drama than in the scheduled ceremony. Lieutenant Cohen felt her anxiety spike as she watched her superior's confident expression begin to waver slightly. She could see that Captain Harrison possessed the same type of command presence that made David such an effective leader, but his was tempered with a diplomatic restraint that her superior seemed to lack in this moment. "Captain, I've commanded soldiers in actual combat situations," David continued, his voice still carrying authority, but with a slight edge that suggested he was beginning to sense that this conversation might not go as planned. "What I see here is pageantry, not military discipline. In real armies, soldiers respond to legitimate commands from senior officers." Captain Harrison stepped closer, his voice remaining level but carrying an unmistakable authority that caused the nearby tourists to grow quiet. "Colonel Ashkenazi, I presume? Your reputation precedes you, and your military service is certainly commendable. However, you seem to have made some assumptions about my soldier that I feel obligated to correct." The use of David's name caught him off guard, suggesting that the British officer had been expecting this encounter, or at least knew more about the Israeli delegation than David had realized. For the first time since the confrontation began, David felt a small flicker of uncertainty about the direction things were taking. "Private Morrison here," Captain Harrison continued, gesturing toward the still motionless guard, "has served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he earned the Military Cross for exceptional bravery under fire. He was personally selected for ceremonial duties based on his outstanding service record and exemplary discipline. His ability to maintain position regardless of distraction isn't theatrical weakness, Colonel. It's professional excellence." The words hit David like a physical blow. The Military Cross was equivalent to some of Israel's highest military honors, and the idea that this young soldier he had been lecturing possessed such distinguished combat credentials fundamentally challenged everything he had assumed about the situation. Captain Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, Colonel, our ceremonial duties aren't separate from our operational capabilities. They're an expression of the same discipline that serves us in combat. The precision you dismiss as pageantry is the same attention to detail that keeps soldiers alive in hostile environments." The crowd around them had grown completely silent, sensing the gravity of what they were witnessing. Even the most casual observers could recognize that the dynamic had shifted dramatically, with the confident foreign officer suddenly finding himself on uncertain ground. David's military mind began processing this new information, his tactical training forcing him to reassess the situation despite his wounded pride. If the British officer was telling the truth about Private Morrison's service record, then David had just spent the last several minutes lecturing a decorated combat veteran about military discipline while displaying his own ignorance of British military culture. The ceremonial guard duties at Buckingham Palace are considered among the highest honors in the British Army, Captain Harrison continued, his voice still professionally controlled but carrying an edge that suggested his patience was nearly exhausted. They're assigned only to soldiers who have proven themselves in both operational and ceremonial roles. What you've interpreted as weakness is actually a demonstration of the highest level of military self-control. Lieutenant Cohen watched her superior's face as the implications of the British officer's words began to sink in. She could see David's confidence wavering as he realized that his assumptions about British military culture had been not just wrong, but embarrassingly so. The diplomatic consequences of this confrontation were becoming more serious with each passing moment. The tourists continued to watch in fascination, many now realizing they were witnessing a significant cultural misunderstanding play out between military officers from allied nations. What had started as an amusing diversion was becoming an education in military traditions and the dangers of making assumptions about foreign customs. The final humbling moment came when Captain Harrison produced a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be official records. "Colonel, since you seem interested in military credentials, perhaps you'd like to know more about the soldiers you've been critiquing." His voice remained professionally courteous, but the underlying message was unmistakable. Private Morrison's unit citation reads, exceptional courage under enemy fire, leading wounded comrades to safety while maintaining defensive positions against overwhelming odds. His tour in Helmand Province included 47 combat engagements. Captain Harrison paused, allowing the weight of those numbers to sink in. The discipline required to stand motionless for hours in ceremonial duties is actually more challenging than many combat situations, requiring a different but equally demanding type of mental fortitude. David felt the foundation of his assumptions crumbling beneath him. 47 combat engagements was an extraordinary number, representing more direct combat experience than many career soldiers ever accumulated. The young man he had been lecturing as an inexperienced actor was actually a highly decorated combat veteran, whose service record would be impressive in any army. The crowd of tourists had grown so quiet that the sound of traffic from the nearby streets seemed amplified. Cameras continued recording, but the atmosphere had shifted from curious entertainment to witnessing what was clearly becoming a profound lesson in cultural humility and military respect. Captain Harrison continued his methodical dismantling of David's assumptions. Our ceremonial protocols aren't arbitrary traditions, Colonel. They represent centuries of military evolution, refined through conflicts from Waterloo to Afghanistan. The precision you see here translates directly to operational effectiveness. The same attention to detail that creates perfect ceremonial formation also creates successful military operations. Lieutenant Cohen could see her superior struggling with the reality of his situation. David's entire worldview about British military culture was being systematically challenged by someone who clearly possessed both the knowledge and authority to make such challenges stick. The diplomatic implications were staggering, but the personal impact on David was even more significant. I understand that different military cultures emphasize different aspects of soldier development, Captain Harrison said, his tone becoming slightly more conciliatory while remaining firm. Israeli military excellence is well respected throughout the world. However, dismissing other nations' military traditions without understanding them doesn't reflect well on the professional judgment we would expect from an officer of your rank and experience. The words were delivered with surgical precision, acknowledging David's legitimate military credentials while making it clear that his behavior had been inappropriate and his assumptions wrong. It was a masterclass in professional rebuke that left room for dignity while making the correction unmistakably clear. David finally found his voice, though it carried none of the confidence that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. Captain, I apologize for my assumptions. It appears I misunderstood the nature of your ceremonial duties and the qualifications of your soldiers. The admission cost him considerable pride, but his military training recognized when tactical retreat was the only honorable option. Apology accepted, Colonel, Captain Harrison replied with professional grace. Perhaps this experience will remind us all of the importance of understanding local customs and military traditions when visiting foreign nations. Our armies share common values of service and sacrifice, even when our expressions of those values differ. The crowd of tourists began to disperse as they realized the confrontation was resolving peacefully. Many had recorded the entire exchange, and the story would soon spread across social media platforms around the world, becoming a lesson about cultural assumptions and military respect that would reach far beyond those who witnessed it firsthand. Private Morrison remained at attention throughout the entire exchange, his discipline unbroken despite being the subject of intense discussion. His professionalism in maintaining ceremonial protocol, while being publicly defended by his commanding officer, demonstrated exactly the type of military bearing that Captain Harrison had described. As the immediate tension began to ease, David looked at the young guard with entirely new eyes. Instead of seeing a costumed performer, he now saw a combat veteran whose military experience commanded respect. The bearskin hat and red tunic no longer appeared theatrical, but rather as symbols of earned honor and distinguished service. The lesson David learned that morning would stay with him for the rest of his career. In later years, he would tell the story to junior officers as an example of the dangers of making assumptions about foreign military traditions. His experience at Buckingham Palace became a reminder that true military professionalism required not just tactical expertise, but also cultural understanding and respect for the different ways that military excellence could be expressed. The diplomatic consequences were ultimately minimal, as both British and Israeli officials recognized the incident as a learning opportunity rather than a serious breach of protocol. David's later meetings with British defense officials proceeded smoothly, with both sides demonstrating the mutual respect that should have characterized the entire visit from the beginning. Lieutenant Cohen would later describe the incident as one of the most educational experiences of her military career, not because of what it taught her about British customs, but because of what it revealed about the importance of approaching foreign military traditions with humility rather than assumptions. The story became legendary in diplomatic and military circles, serving as a permanent reminder that even experienced officers could benefit from occasional lessons in cultural sensitivity and professional respect.